This is going to be a short introduction and awareness session on fire safety in the workplace. My name's Chris Docherty. I work for FQM. We are a QHSE consultancy, training and software organisation. So I hope this gives you a little bit of insight into the awareness requirements around fire in the workplace. We do have additional training courses that go beyond this, which you can pick up on our website. So, fire safety awareness. So the objective of this is to try and provide you with a description of the principles of fire initiation, what their classifications are and how they can spread. Outline the principles of fire risk assessment, which was brought in 1999 as a requirement by law. Describe the basics of the principles of fire prevention and prevention of fire in buildings in particular, and identify appropriate fire alarm systems and methods of fighting fire. Outline the factors of how you inform personnel, humans, and make them aware of how they can remove themselves from the fire, and understand some of the basic legal requirements around that as well. So a little bit about statistics. These figures are actually from 2018. So there were approximately 35,000 reported fires at work in the UK. There were 30 fatalities associated to those fires and around 2,500 injuries. It is important to recognise one of the biggest factors in fire at the workplace is associated to financial loss. Financial loss can be significantly high, and in some cases it can be reported in some years that up to 40% of businesses that report a significant fire never start up again. There are many cases where there has been significant impact by fire, and often coming from a small source, and these are just a couple that we present on this slide here. So let's talk a little bit about the law. So dating back to 1947, there was a responsibility for fire authority. Then in 1971, there was a Fire Precautions Act. That was very much focused on firefighting equipment and means of escape within the workplace. In 1999, the Fire Precautions Workplace Regulation was introduced, which brought about more premises, not just focused on high-risk premises, and it had a very significant area focused on establishing risk assessment. And the 1999 Workplace Regulation falls within the Health and Safety at Workplace Act. 2005, there was a fire safety order put in place, and it was much more focused on prevention. It's much more focused on putting people in place to understand how they can prevent fire in the workplace, and also introduced a duty, or a more precise duty, to ensure the safety of employees. And it was a bit of reinforcement on the risk assessment approach. It's worth noting that fire in the UK is devolved. So, for example, in Scotland, there is a Fire Scotland Act that forms very closely to the order from the UK Parliament. So, taking from the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, there are duties of employers. So on their employees, there is a duty to provide safe equipment and safe systems of work where appropriate. Safe use, handling and storage of substances, in particular those which can be a source for a fire. Provision of information, instruction, training, and training, and where required, supervision in that. And of course, the requirement to provide safe place of work, allowing for access and egress within the building and to escape from the building. And on top of that comes safe and appropriate and adequate welfare facilities that doesn't bring about undue risk associated to fire as well. Continuing with that, Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act talks about members of the public, contractors, so other people that are not within the employment of the company. This could include members of the public, customers, people visiting your site for whatever reason, and goes into a lot more detail about what the responsibilities of the employer is in those situations. And then there's other sections on landlords, and owners and people that are in control of premises, and that might be relevant to you if you are working in a shared office environment, for example, where you are a tenant or a subtenant, and the landlord may have certain responsibilities around firefighting equipment, testing it, and ensuring that it's serviced and maintained. It is important also to recognise that there are employees' responsibilities, not just employers within the Health and Safety at Work Act associated to fire. So they must take responsible care for themselves and others. So the acts or omissions that they do can be lawfully chargeable against them if inappropriate. They must cooperate with their employer to fulfil their duties as an employee around the acts and regulations. And it's important to understand that there's no misuse or interference with any safety provisions, which we would refer to as maybe horseplay. So there is definitions within the fire safety legislation that's quite important, and it refers to responsible person. This responsible person could be the employer or an appointed person at the employer's side, or a person in control of the premises like a landlord or someone who is maintaining the equipment, the premises for the landlord, or it could be someone that is appointed by the employer and given those duties to a responsible person. It's important to recognise that if you are in a shared environment, there might have to be agreements in place around that, who takes ultimate control and responsibility. And it's also important to recognise that there is enforcement by fire and rescue authority in these situations. So these activities we're referring to do not cover the process related to fire precautions. So this is more just about the top end duties associated to that. So there are some general categories that fall into the employer's duties, in that they must have in place a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. They must keep the risk assessment under review, which means where there are changes in situations, changes in the law, they must undertake an assessment and a review of it. And ultimately what they want to try and do is demonstrate that they have eliminated or reduced the risk to a suitable and sufficient level. Ensure that the premises are provided with appropriate detection and firefighting equipment. It's important to recognise the use of the word appropriate. So it's what's fit for purpose for your organisation. So there is nowhere in the law that states what you must have in place in terms of the technology and so on and so forth. But it's important that it's appropriate and demonstrable to be efficient and working for your place of work. The employer and employees must ensure that the emergency exit routes are clear, people are aware of them, and that includes individuals that may come to your offices or sites or workplaces that are not familiar with it. You must include there are arrangements in place for fire drills. So that's not just testing the equipment, but this is undertaking formal drills to ensure that they work, and appoint competent persons to assist in these activities, often referred to as fire wardens. There are a significant number of additional responsibilities on fire wardens, and this is covered in another training course that we do that will not fall under these free webinars. It goes into so much more detail, typically runs for almost a day. Employers also have a duty to provide necessary information to their employees and other persons that may be involved or coming into their workplace. And it's important to recognise that this can be just individuals that are stepping in for a short period of time. Provide adequate training for staff. So this could be associated to, for example, induction, or where employees have additional responsibilities, ensure that they have the recognised training that they need. And it's important to recognise some of the pitfalls that can happen in organisations, which we have seen, where individuals are inducted into a business, they're maybe made aware of fire precautions, fire emergency measures. This might have been 10 years ago, and nothing has been updated or refreshed. It's important to keep this fresh. It's important to ensure that you check on a regular basis that your employees are aware of what they need to do. The fire drill is a good example of how you can determine that, but it is important when you identify any things that don't go quite to plan, that you put plans in place to correct it. And you must keep records, okay? This is legally required that records are retained in these situations, and this can be retained in various ways: fire logbooks, electronic systems, etc. So let's get into some of the basic principles of fire itself. So fire cannot occur unless there are three principles that are present, okay? Fuel, oxygen, and heat, often referred to as the fire triangle. As well as that, we have to think about sources of ignition. So can it be a naked flame? It could be external or internal sparks. It could be hot surfaces, static electricity, and many more. The sources of fuel that we're referring to is, if it can burn, it is effectively a source of fuel. It can be a solid, a liquid, a gas form, it doesn't matter. If it burns, it can be a source of fuel to ensure that that fire continues to burn. A fire needs oxygen. Now, obviously, there is oxygen in the air, around about 21%, but of course, we have to think about what additional oxygen could bring about to drive that fire even further. So it could be significant wind coming in that drives the oxygen level up because there's more air. It could be different types of oxygen cylinders that may be used in welding, excuse me, or cutting activities. It could also be oxygen that's contained in types of chemicals, for example, nitrates, phosphates, etc. Getting into the classifications of fires. So there's 5 main classifications that we refer to, and they're referred to as A through to F. Class A talks about solids associated to woods, papers, plastics, furnishings. Class B is associated to the burning of liquids, which could be paints, oils, solvents, chemicals, so on and so forth. Class C is associated to gases, for example, butane, propane. Class D is the burning of metals. And Class F is high temperature cooking oils and fats, often referred to in restaurants and cooking premises. We would also use them at home, for example, in some cases. Plus, we have to think about that it's not recognised as a class, but it is recognised that electrical fires can provide an additional source of ignition to these other classifications. Typically, fire extinguishers are designed and provided to tackle one or more of the classifications of fire, and that's why that's been put in place. So let's think about how heat transfers and how fires can spread. So 4 main areas we look at here, which is the convection, conduction, radiation, and direct contact. So when we talk about convection, we're referring to hot air rising and cold air being drawn into the fire, which, as I mentioned before, has 21% of oxygen, and therefore that fresh air, cold air that comes in as the hot air rises brings about additional sources to continue the fire, which is referred to as convection. Conduction, which is through the material itself. So, for example, there are good conductors of heat transmission and fire spreading through the likes of copper, steel, aluminium, if the temperatures are high enough. There are, of course, also good insulators, and these often are things that have been put into buildings like concrete, brickwork, and certainly in the days going past there's asbestos, which brings about additional risk. Third one is radiation. So there is enough intensity in the fire to spread and ignite another adjacent surface or material, and direct contact, where something is in direct contact with the item which is on fire and then spreads in this way. So, causes of fires. So, when we look at fires in buildings, this data again comes from 2017-2018, and we've excluded homes, dwellings associated to that. So we find about 22% of the total number is around associated to private garages and sheds. This could be where you keep your car, not associated to a private dwelling, so it's not something that's within a private dwelling, but it's a private garage where cars may be repaired or cars may be stored. Retail distribution, so this is more associated to warehouses, for example. Restaurants, cafes and pubs take about 9% of that. Industrial units, about 8%, and recreational areas, maybe 6%. When we break those numbers down as well, we find that actually the greatest number is associated to deliberate cause, referred to as arson. Excuse me. The next most significant factor is faulty electrical appliances. This is quite an important area simply because many people do not recognise the source of or the ignition coming from electrical appliances, and often do not put in the proper measures and checks around electrical appliances. And this includes the installation of the electrical supply within your facility, and not just necessary pieces of equipment individually. The next significant one is misuse of equipment, just not using equipment properly, not maintaining it properly. Accidental, where people just genuinely make mistakes, and then there are a whole multitude of others in there as well. So, consequences. Well, obviously one of the biggest consequences of a fire is death. However, that is much lower in comparison to other consequences, but it still is the most significant one, the highest risk possible. This can come actually from being burnt, a mixture of being burnt and smoke or gas inhalation, and the most important one really is that the main area that this comes from is one of the main points of getting people out of the facility is people get overcome by gas or smoke, collapse, and are not able to leave the facility. Personal injury also equates for about 1,300 people within the workplace. Building damage, one of the most significant areas, as we spoke about before, about 40% of the issues associated to building damage. Often these buildings cannot be used again, and often the businesses cease to operate. Impact on the environment, so air pollution, water pollution, depending on what's within your facility. There could be chemicals and sources that can access into the watercourse that can have an impact wider on the environment. Of course, there is also the situation that depending on where you're located, there could be impact on the environment from the point of flora and fauna in terms of forests, moorland, etc., etc. And of course, what we have to think about here is when these situations happen, the impact beyond that, which is potential the loss of the business, the loss of employment, and those situations bring about additional concern, heartache, mental health issues, etc., etc. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of the requirements around the law. So as I mentioned before, there is a legal requirement to undertake a fire risk assessment. That fire risk assessment can be done in a multitude of ways, but it is important that it's recognised that it follows what we would class as 5 basic steps. The person that undertakes the fire risk assessment we would typically recommend that they are someone that has been appointed as a competent person. So that could be someone external to the business that comes in to undertake that fire risk assessment, and then it gets reviewed regularly. Or it could be someone inside the business that has the competence and knowledge to be able to do that. You have to be able to demonstrate that you do have that competence and knowledge if it is tested in a situation where there has been a fire. This may be tested by the authority, or it may be tested by your insurance organisation. It is important to recognise, because it's a legal requirement, often insurance companies, this will be one of the first things they look at to see if you have this appropriate measure in place and have been following it. Okay, so let's jump in here. So number one, identify the hazard. Referring back to the fire triangle we spoke about before, we want to be looking at what are the potential hazards in the workplace that could cause a fire. So is there anything that is combustible? What about sources of heat and ignition? Whether it's that in normal use, due to carelessness, or it could also be in the situations where there is additional heat or ignition in particular jobs that are not done very often. You may bring someone onto your site, a contractor, to do a particular piece of work that brings about this additional source of heat and ignition. Have you considered that in a separate risk assessment, that how it impacts upon fire? What about cooking in the workplace? Obviously, if you are a cooking establishment, then that's quite different. But obviously, we have to think about cooking that happens within factories, within warehouses, inside of canteens and welfare facilities. What about smoking materials? So what about materials where people are actually undertaking the pastime of smoking? How, obviously, with the new laws in place, that's controlled much greater. But as I still find regularly, people still undertake this and are allowed to undertake this in areas where they shouldn't be, whether that be from not following the rules or the rules being overlooked and ignored both by employees and employers. Then we have to think about hot equipment and activities, burning activities, welding activities, all these different things. And we have to also remember that in some cases it could be equipment where the source of heat may be internal to it. So it could be an oven, it could be some type of bath, etc. We have to think about our electrical equipment. As I mentioned, it could be the installation of the electrical facility, or it could go much further than that and be down to all the various elements of electrical items, how those are controlled, how those are monitored, etc., etc. And of course, we have to consider in our risk assessment what the potential is of a deliberate act of arson. Now, the likelihood of that happening by someone inside the business is extremely low. It does happen, but it's extremely low. But what we have to think about is the likelihood of arson from an external source, from kids, from teenagers, initially thinking they're playing about because they have the ability to access a source that they can set fire to, thinking they're playing about. But what about the transfer of that fire we spoke about earlier? So it may be material outside of the building that then transfers onto something else, and before we know it, a fire has occurred inside the building at a time possibly when it's closed. And we also have to think about unsafe acts and conditions. So smoking, as I said, next to combustibles, possibly open stairwells that are not controlled very well for fire emergencies. What about having things within the building that just add so much more potential to the hazard, like polystyrene tiles, etc. Then we get on to point two. So point two is identifying the persons that are at significant risk. Obviously, employees are going to be up there, the people that will work in the locations, and there may be some that are more exposed than others depending on where they work. These may be the people that work in the areas which there are extreme heat, there are extreme potential for the fire. We also have to think about the contractors we bring in to our site, our offices, those contractors that may actually bring in additional hazard, additional risks, and how we control them, ensuring that they have appropriate risk assessments and methods of management in place. What about our visitors? What about people that we invite into our offices, our customers, for example? Could be members of the public coming in. What controls do we have in place, and what information would we share with them? We first of all, before we do that, have to recognise who would come in. Then we have to think, are there any people with additional special considerations or needs? People that may have other issues, other concerns of how they would exit a building, for example. They may be wheelchair users, etc. They may be people that are hard of hearing. We have to consider these things when we are looking at the potential people that are at significant risk. And then included in that, we have to think about young people. Do we hire young people in our organisation? Do we bring people in during school summer holidays, or coming from Christmas holidays, etc., whatever it may be? Do we recognise these young people, and do we put the proper supervision that's required associated to them? This would be in a general risk assessment basis, I would say, but specifically associated to fire, we still have to follow that. Then when we understand what those hazards are and who the potential impact could be on, we then have to look at evaluating the risk and ultimately trying to reduce the risk. So we term this as the principle of prevention, and this came about as the additional acts that were put in place and different legal requirements back in the 90s. Ideally, we want to eliminate, we want to remove the source. Can we take that item away? Can we not do it? Can we not use it? Can we tackle it at source? So it may be that we understand that our electrical systems have some problems. So therefore we tackle it at source and replace it or get it fixed. We may want to replace dangerous items. So it could be chemicals that we use with items that are less dangerous. We may have that capability to do that. And this could even be just down to aerosols we use within the facility for cleaning. We may have the capability to use items that are less dangerous. Giving appropriate instruction. One of the most fundamental things is to ensure that people understand the risks associated to items that they're working with and what instructions they should follow when using them, when using the equipment, and importantly, if something goes wrong. And we have to give consideration for our fire detection and warning systems. And again, we're not going to talk about what it is you have to have in place. It's appropriate to the hazards and risks of your workplace. We have to be able to consider our means of escape and how we ensure people are aware of them. What about information and signage? You know, information that's provided around greater sources of fire, and also information and signage around means of escape, what way they have to follow, where they have to go, and the firefighting arrangements that are in place and who has responsibility for doing that, and what items they need to be aware of that can be used. We then have to think about the record of these findings within this risk assessment. So important, date the assessment, identify the hazards, what staff or others are at risk, a production action or produce an action in terms of what plan we're going to follow, and importantly, what areas we're going to address in terms of training our staff. And the last area is really about regularly reviewing. Are there any changes that come about which may be internal to our business or external to our business? So these are internal and external issues that would be relevant to a fire risk assessment. So is it to do with the occupancy, the people that come into our business? Is it to do with activities? Are we doing something different? Are we bringing additional people in to do something different that raises the hazards and risks? Or what about the materials that are used and stored? I've seen it before where people who are senior within an organisation have something at home, run out of space and bring it into the workplace to store it, but don't then recognise the impact that that has upon the workplace in terms of additional hazards that's been brought in. So when we think about a fire risk assessment, we want to consider these protocols. So the likelihood of something happening and the severity of that if it does happen. So in terms of likelihoods, we're looking for, is it low, medium, high? And in terms of the harm it can cause, slightly harmful, harmful, extremely harmful. And again, this is relevant and appropriate to your place of work. What is extremely high risk or seen as high risk in one workplace could potentially be classed as medium risk in another workplace, depending upon the controls and methods they have in place. So there is no one fit for all in the case of this. Yes, I recognise that using a template is a good practice, and I'd probably say at this point, if you want to access templates for this sort of activity, then go to our free resources area on our website and you can pick up free risk assessments, for example. But it is important when you use a template that you do not use the content that's within it. The content has to be appropriate to your place of work. And the method that you use in terms of undertaking the risk assessment has to be appropriate to the people at your workplace. Okay, let's get into a little bit more detail about fire prevention and the prevention of spreading a fire. So this is captured typically within the evaluation and the evacuation part of a risk assessment. So one of the key things that all businesses should consider is good housekeeping and storage. That can be across the board in terms of cardboards, woods, anything that has that potential for a source of fuel. And we want to control as much as possible any ignitions or sources that we have. So this is the electricals, the equipment, the different spark potentials and so on that we have in place. In some cases, there may have to be additional safe systems of work and procedures which should be specifically followed to ensure that we have control over these potential situations. When we get into housekeeping and storage, we want to reduce the chances of blocked fire exits. You know, it's quite a common process that I've seen that people put stuff in front of a fire exit for a short period of time while they're doing something else, not realizing that they maybe get taken away to do another job and suddenly that fire exit's blocked. We must remember and as much as possible put signage in place and educate people the method and use of the access and egress, and therefore ensuring that fire routes are clear at all times. And we've got to think about reducing the chances of concealing fire extinguishers and alarm points. How often I have seen fire extinguishers being taken and used for another source, something to prop a door open, something to hold something down because of its weight. It's important that fire extinguishers are in recognised places and recognised points that everyone in the organisation knows where they are. And then let's think about waste. Waste is a huge source of fuel for a fire. So are they kept in suitable containers? Where possible, can we keep them away from the building to minimise that impact? And what about the control of the fuel sources, the oils, the solvents, the gases, the aerosol cans? Can we first of all try and substitute them with items that are less hazardous? Or where we cannot substitute them, can we ensure that we have controls in place? Do we have gas storage locations outside of the building, far enough away? Are people using the gas storage locations? Or actually, if you walked around your facility, would you find a few bottles inside the gas storage, but others dotted about the facility because people have not recognised the risks, the harm that could potentially happen because of that, and they are not being corrected. You know, others are walking past, others are ignoring it, and suddenly it becomes a natural behaviour or cultural way that that's what happens. It's important that these responsibilities are passed down from the employer to the employee to ensure that the correct methods of minimising the exposure of these sources of fuels by ensuring correct storage. What about the ignition sources? So are they being maintained, in particular around electrical items, whether they are fixed or portable? Are they being checked? Are they being maintained? Remember, a large area around the source of fires came from electrical items not being maintained properly. What about good management of smoking areas, which is another ignition source? Proper control over heating appliances, boilers that may heat your business, items that may form refrigeration in certain locations. Regular cleaning or maintaining of different types of equipment. So it is important to recognise, and that's why we do the risk assessment to identify where those ignition sources are and what controls we put in place and ensure we keep documented evidence of that. So let's think about the fire detection and alarm systems that we may have. So it's important and vital that everyone is alerted as soon as possible when there is a fire. There must be the capability for people to escape before a fire takes hold, and should have some form of detector or warning system in place, ideally to help with that. So what we've got to think about here is the method that people would use. So inside your risk assessment, your fire plan, and your evacuation methods, we would want to identify what type of method is used to alert people. So it can be enough to shout if that's appropriate, but I would always consider that there are gongs, whistles, klaxons, air horns, things you can buy from a store for £15. If you have not got a fixed fire warning system in place. Now, it may be the method and how your business operates. It requires a fixed warning system with call points and sirens and a control panel. But if you're not in that situation, whether it be financially or not, you have to think about what you can put in place that's appropriate and will work inside your workplace. If you do have whistles, gongs, klaxons, air horns, whatever it may be, test them. Also, you must remember in some cases that they can run out and they need to be replaced. So some of the control measures inside your risk assessment may be that an air horn is replaced once a year, or if it is used as part of a genuine fire, then it's replaced immediately afterwards. What about escaping before a fire takes hold? The method and how you alert everyone, is it recognisable by everyone? Can it be heard in all locations? It's all good and well having an extremely good warning system when you have a location at the far side of your building, inside another sub-building where work takes place and people are using ear defenders, for example, and may not be able to hear it. In those situations, your safe system of work should be able to recognise how these people are informed in such situations where there is a fire. And what about in terms of alternatives for people who have difficulty leaving the building or for people who have difficulty in hearing? What type of systems do you have in place? Do you have a buddy system? Do you have other visual or other methods with aid that can help these individuals? And that all would come out within your risk assessment when we spoke about the people who we have to consider and the impact it could have on them. Now getting into fire extinguishing systems. So typically there are four main ways to extinguish a fire: cooling a fire, smothering a fire, starvation of the fire, or a chemical reaction. So cooling, pretty straightforward. We want to reduce the heat within the fire, and therefore typically the most obvious way to do that is by means of water. Smothering the fire is really ultimately about taking the oxygen that's available to the fire away and prevent further combustion. So this can be done by means of a fire blanket, for example, putting that over a cooking appliances, or by means of a fire extinguisher with foam. Let's think also about starvation. So if the fire is being fueled, we want to think about terminating and isolating the gas supply. Remember, what we're talking about here is being able to do all of this in a safe and controlled way. This is not asking for any gung-ho activity where people are jumping in. This is where you can do it in a safe way. We also want to think about what other sources of fuel there are, what other chemicals there may be, what other paper, wood, any source that could continue. We want to try and isolate the fire such that we extinguish it naturally. Other things we want to think about is chemical reaction. So interruptions or combustions. So if there is a chemical process where we can use particular types of extinguishers that would counteract one another, therefore reducing the impact of the fire. We also have to think about the fixed installations in terms of fire premises. So these are often seen within warehouse premises and particularly in new office facilities. There are significant costs if you're putting them in after the event. And you also have to think about what the impact could be from an insurance point of view. If it's accidentally released, could it have an impact on stock within your facility? So going in a little bit more detail, this is a small pictorial about fire extinguishers and the different types. And it's important, I would say at this point, that to always keep abreast of the changes. This comes from the 2017-2018, so it's important to keep abreast of changes in the types of fire extinguishers available and what's appropriate for the hazards within your workplace, and particularly the sources within your workplace. There's new technology coming out all the time, so it's important to keep on top of this and recognise what it is that would be appropriate for your workplace. And these different types of extinguishers shown in this pictorial recognise which can be used in which type of source of fire. So let's get on to a little bit more detail about the inspection, maintenance and testing of fire equipment. So whatever is installed or in place at your workplace, it's got to be able to respond when there is an actual emergency. So this is including your detection systems that are in place, which could be sounders, which could be lighting, which could also be sprinkler type systems as well. And they must be checked and maintained as per manufacturer's recommendations, but also there are some legal requirements and suggestions as well that these must be checked on a regular basis as well. And we must be able to demonstrate that we keep records to demonstrate these checks are done. Now, this can be done in a fire logbook, can be done on an electronic system of evidence, or it could be done by a third party that does that for you. Okay, moving on. Let's think a little bit here now more about the evacuation and means of escape. So it's important that people can escape. It's important that you need to recognise that in some cases they may have to pass or move in the opposite direction from where the source of fire is. So you've got to be able to demonstrate within your means of evacuation the method and areas that people can go to remove themselves from the building, remove themselves from the source. In case of some corridors, there may be a requirement, depending upon the potential hazards in the workplace, that need to be protected. And therefore, there might have to be self-closing doors to try and isolate fires where possible. It is important where there are fire doors in place and fire doors that are required, and I see this regularly where fire doors are propped open. Self-closing, of course, is fantastic, but can be an expensive option. But I see regularly fire doors with signs on them saying must remain closed is a fire door, but people prop them open for whatever means, because they're going in and out the door regularly, or because there's additional heat, for example, in the location, it is important that fire doors are recognised that they're there for a multitude of purposes. Doors usually open in the direction of travel, so it's important to check that when you're in a facility or you're looking to move into a new facility. The escape routes, they must be clear. There shouldn't be any obstructions, and particularly there shouldn't be additional fire hazards inside those escape routes. So there shouldn't be a congregation of cardboards or chemicals kept within these escape routes. And it's important also that they're well lit, because depending on when a fire happens, it could be in the darkness of night or just simply in late on afternoon in the winter. But also it's important to recognise it could be a source coming from electrical, and therefore could isolate the electrical source that's going to the lighting, and the place could be in darkness. So it's important to recognise, one, that people understand that could happen, they understand the route and means of escape, and you have in place appropriate lighting where required, or signage where required that would be illuminated at night so that people can exit. Exit signs with direction arrows should provide evidence and demonstration to everyone within the building, the method and route that they take, whether that be inside or outside the building as well. So let's think about evacuation procedures and emergency plans. So again, we have a fairly decent template around an evacuation procedure that should be written, and with that we also show an example of an emergency plan and what that should look like. It's important to recognise that you capture all the floors within your facility, all the different locations, both internally and externally, where work takes place, and there are potential opportunity for fire. And it's important that these evacuation procedures and emergency plans are introduced to your workforce or people that come into your facility for a period of time. Okay, not necessarily referring to a visitor that comes in and goes, in particular one that is going to be with someone at all times. But when we're talking about, for example, a contractor that comes onto your facility and maybe working in a location that they will not be chaperoned, for example, a boiler room or a workshop where someone else isn't working, they have to be introduced to your evacuation procedures and part of the process of them being inducted into the business. Let's also think about the drills that we have to do. So we need to ensure that our staff are educated on our evacuation procedures and plans. And one of the best ways of assessing their competency and understanding of that is undertaking a fire drill. Remember, a fire drill is not seen as a test. A test is a means of checking that equipment works well, fire alarms, for example. A drill is a means of checking the whole process, ensuring that everything that you have identified in your risk assessment through to everything in your plan works appropriately. And remember that your plan is purpose-built for your organisation, and therefore your drill should be purpose-built as well. So the method in which you would follow in terms of a regular fire should be as close as possibly mimicked in the process of doing your fire drill. What do we mean by that? Don't inform people. Ideally, the one main responsible person that would govern and look after this is the person that activates the fire alarm, that activates the sounder, informs people, and follows the process depending on what that is within your evacuation procedure, and ensuring people are removed from the building. Where appropriate, it's ideally recommended that this is done twice a year, and ensure that all staff are covered. Remember and think about staff that are on holiday, staff that are on sick leave, or staff that are maybe seconded to another location and come back. Have you ensured that you've captured them? And it's important that there are records maintained of these drills taking place, who was there, how well it was performed, and importantly, where there are errors, where there are weaknesses, that these are implemented, improvements are implemented to ensure that those weaknesses are reduced. There are a whole bunch of additional duties, as I said at the start of this session, which fall under what's classed as a fire warden. And these vary from company to company and can include additional testing, methods of them undertaking duties of responsibility in the workplace around ensuring the workplaces, escape routes, ensuring the extinguishers and call points, etc., etc. So these duties, if they're appointed, have a legal responsibility, and it is important that these fire wardens are formally trained and are demonstrated to be competent in the duties they're asked to perform, and that you ensure that these individuals have all the correct documentation in place to support that. As well as normal day-to-day duties of a fire warden, there are significantly more duties under an emergency situation. And it is important, this is why we do the fire drills, that these individuals, as much as possible, we can see that they have the competence and the understanding of how to take on these emergency duties in these situations. These can include simple things like ensuring that the rescue service's contact information is up to date, that they have checked and monitored equipment and information that's in place. One of the things we would say here is, having had a quick run through this information we've presented, how safe from fires is your workplace or your home? What about if it catches fire? Do you think you've got the correct practices in place, the correct equipment? Do you think there's some weaknesses in your place of work? This could be the time for you to go back and look at your place of work, maybe consider whether maybe there could be weaknesses. Are there things you're not doing that you should be doing? For example, fire drills. Do you have a fire risk assessment? Do you have an evacuation procedure? And have you considered asking randomly some people in your workplace if they're aware of what that is? Hopefully this was beneficial, and as I said, this is just a small taster introduction. We also have additional training sessions that are available, and we've got lots more training webinars that are available on our YouTube channel and LinkedIn, and we would love you to subscribe and follow us. Please look down in the comments or any of the other videos that you can follow on. Thank you.